Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. In the last podcast, we touched on this concept that nothing happens by cause and effect. Everything is the emergent of a system. And we related it to trying to determine how much control you have in your life and in your world. And if things are emergent or results of entire systems running, then how do we have any control if a bunch of those components of those systems are outside of our influence? And what we determined in that podcast is that when we have influence over elements in our lives, we usually have more control than we realize. And when we don't have control, we usually have less control than we realize. Like when we can't influence a system, we oftentimes get the most frustrated and we sort of beat our heads against the wall because we want to have control when we're not understanding the things that we actually do have control over. So our recommendation was to get really good at understanding how systems work, get really good at removing ourselves from this concept of cause and effect, and get really good at figuring out the etymology of a result as it pertains to an entire system running. Now, one of the things we mentioned in the last podcast was that there's this big node in every system that we call time and unforeseen occurrence, or just sheer dumb luck. So if there's this huge influential node called luck that feels like it's entirely out of our control, then what do we do about that? Is there any way to influence luck?
You might have heard the phrase, this is a phrase I've heard most of my life, luck favors the prepared. So this notion of there are things that come in your life, you might get lucky or unlucky, and if you're prepared, you might be able to capitalize on that luck. I remember this one time I was at a conference when I was younger, and I was talking with this woman who, it was like this conference, the different booths set up at professional conferences. I was speaking to this woman, and I found out through the course of conversation that she was one of the people that works at a book publishing company that publishes, finds new authors to publish them. And we were talking, we struck up this conversation, and she seemed to be interested in some of the ideas I had, and it seemed like I had good energy, and she was vibing with the energy I brought. And she said, she was telling me about her career, and I said, "Wow, how does that work? How do you find new authors? How does that play out?" And she explained it to me, and then she said, "I really like your energy. Do you have any book ideas? Do you have anything that we could talk about to publish, maybe in our company?" And I froze. I wasn't prepared at all for this lucky break of a person who could talk to me about maybe getting a book published and furthering my career, furthering things that would happen in my life. I had no preparation for the luck that I stumbled into in that moment. And I made a vow that the next time I was in front of somebody and they proposed a book idea or hey, do you have any ideas for a book? I would always have something prepared and ready to go, because I can't predict when that circumstance might happen again. So I think that's just an example of what it means to have luck favors the prepared.
Yeah, well, on a flip side, you can have somebody maybe physically attack you, and if you have zero ability to defend yourself, then you are not going, luck is not favoring you in that situation because you're being physically attacked by somebody who might be stronger, a better fighter, overpowering you. And if you have figured out ways to defend yourself, then in that situation, maybe luck is on your side because you get attacked, but you are more than capable of fending off the person who attacked you. So in that situation, luck favored the prepared in the sense that you were taken off. You just happened to be the wrong place at the wrong time, but you were in a position to be able to not, be on the receiving end of somebody's pummeling. You were able to defend yourself off. And the same thing applies in multiple contexts. The more ready you are, the more skills you develop, and the more tools you collect over time, the more when you're in a situation that you couldn't have prepared for it, right? Because that's the point of luck. Luck just happens. It's just a situation that you get thrown in, a context that you couldn't have planned for mentally. So you have to be able to show up by just bringing who you are and all of the things that you have developed over the course of your life.
I think people see this idea of luck as definitely a positive connotation. Sometimes I would say it's either positive or negative. There's definitely there's a charge to it. You're either lucky or you're unlucky in some kind of circumstance. And it's I got lucky in this circumstance, or I was unlucky in this circumstance. It's like this external locus of control that you basically have no influence over or no control over. And this notion of the luck favors the prepared means that if you want to get lucky in a situation, you'll have preparation, like what you're talking about. Maybe you get attacked, you can fight off your attacker. That is a situation where I wouldn't say you got lucky. I mean, basically circumstances happened to you that weren't ideal, and you had prepared yourself to be able to deal with circumstances that were hostile towards you physically.
Right.
But this idea of lucky or unlucky, you notice there's people in your life. As you look around in your life, you listening, you're going to notice some people seem to have luck over and over again. They seem to, even without trying, circumstances in their lives seem to work out. They seem just to get lucky all the time. Things work out for them. And then you look around and you find other people in your life that have unlucky circumstances. Like there are trends. There are people in your life that you're like, man, that person just can't catch a break, can they? Everything they do or everything they endeavor to do, everything that happens in their life, they seem like they don't have any luck. It's just unlucky, man, over and over again. And I guess the question I have, is that just the nature of the universe? Is some people are just lucky and other people are unlucky? Is that something happening externally of themselves? Or are there things that are happening, influencers and systems running, that make it look like someone is getting lucky or unlucky? But it's actually much more influential of the person involved than would look to the surface.
Yeah. I have things to say on what you just said, but every time you say get lucky, I have to laugh. Would you be willing to say be lucky for the rest of this podcast? Because otherwise, literally every time you say get lucky, I'm going to laugh because I'm a 10-year-old boy. So
no, I'm going to say it every time now.
Okay. Like my humor sophistication level is basically a fifth grader. So
I'll do my best
to
deal with the fifth grader across from me right now. But yes.
Every time you said get lucky, I went tee hee hee in my mind.
If my two sons were listening, they think it's funny too.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's all good.
So yeah, I think the other thing is that luck favors the advantaged, right? It's almost like we have, in systems thinking, there's a concept, and again, we talked a lot about systems thinking in the last podcast, but we didn't talk about the thing that's called initial conditions, which is really important in systems thinking. Systems are set up initially, whether they evolve over time or whether or not they're designed, they have, as soon as the system kind of locks into place, and now it's like it's closed or open or whatever, it's like now its own system running with specific emergence or results, that the second it was set up, that's called initial conditions. And your initial conditions are pretty important. Like if you're born in a part of the world where they have extremely high infant mortality, and you are not really projected, you have maybe a 50% chance of living to 5 years old, your initial conditions are pretty important there. Like you may or may not survive that, and it had nothing to do with you. You just happened to be born in a situation where the initial conditions are very, they're not conducive to really getting anything done. And then other people have initial conditions where they are born into maybe extraordinary wealth or influence or power, that they're born into families that already have set up initial conditions for them where maybe they even skate through life. They just find themselves going to one great opportunity after another. So luck doesn't just favor the prepared, it also favors the advantaged. And for those people who are not advantaged, then preparation becomes even more important. So there's a concept that, the question of are some people lucky and other people unlucky? That's a question for the universe. Like, we don't know. We have no idea whether or not there's a sense of luck that some people have. There seems to be better and worse initial conditions. And there also seems to be some people who are more driven to want to improve their conditions, and other people who are more driven to a place of homeostasis where they just want to keep what they have. And there are some people whose initial conditions might encourage them towards self-destruction. And so they actually regress in their progress, or they regress in their circumstances of life. And who knows what their initial conditions were. Maybe they're dealing with some sort of chemical imbalance, and their initial conditions is that like their brain isn't operating, at an optimal level. So there's lots of components to initial conditions that should be remembered when we're looking at systems and trying to determine like what can we influence and what we can't. And there's definitely a component of advantage. There's a component that some people have much more advantaged situations than others. If you are listening to this podcast, though, you have the ability to connect to the internet. You have a device that you're listening to it on, which is a consumer technology that outpaces literally anything else that's ever been experienced in human history. So you have some components that allow you to have a certain level of advantage. Now, you might not have all the other advantages that other people might have, because getting your hands on the internet and consumer technology is more and more available to more and more people. I mean, there are entire villages in other countries, developing countries for sure, not developed countries by any stretch, that will move their villages away from rivers, higher up onto mountains. They'll move them away from resources that the village was set there specifically to take advantage of that resource, like a river, move them higher up in a mountain in order to get an internet signal, because they recognize how important it is to be connected. And obviously they have devices that they're utilizing the internet through. So you don't have to be massively advantaged in order to have, access to this podcast. But that gives you a host of resources that nobody else on the planet has ever had before this time period. So our advantages are also becoming increasingly democratized around the world.
Yeah, and I think when we talk about advantage, I just want to make a quick note about this. There's a lot of narrative cast onto advantage. There's a lot of, sometimes it can be a topic that has a lot of things attached to it. There's a lot of emotional charge sometimes that comes up with this notion. And I would just say that remember that humans do not measure themselves from any objective measurement. We measure ourselves in relation to other humans. So I want to just split this idea of advantage. There's collective human advantage we have, like all the technologies we've developed. We've developed certain technologies as a species, as a collection, like farming, storing food, transportation, communication networks. There's all these baseline advantages we have. The internet is one of them that all of us, or most of us as humanity, can access and utilize. And then there's individual advantages that arise out of that are not collective advantages. It's just somebody like a really great athlete that was born with an amazing ability and a talent that has an advantage over most other people.
Right, and the context where they were able to take advantage of those skills young enough, maybe at 3 years old. I mean, if you look at the athletes that do the best, it's not just that they had a talent, but also they had the context where people observed it young enough to capitalize on it, and then they spent a lifetime of building it. So those are advantages too that they couldn't control.
Yeah, I just want to be very clear. We're not talking about advantage in a political term or in a socioeconomic term. Now, those could be emergence of this, but we're talking about advantage much more fundamentally than that. Zoom out a little bit from any kind of charge you might have around the word, oh, you're just advantaged. And think in terms of the species as humans, and then the individuation from the species of individuals that arise above or advantaged from that. And that's, I guess I just want to make that distinction to make sure you understand exactly what we're saying.
Right. We're not talking about privilege. I think
Correct.
That's usually the word that you're referencing, Joel, which is this concept of privilege. Privilege exists too. I mean, there are some people who are we just talked about some people who are born in countries where the infant mortality rate means you have a 50% shot of dying by the time you're 5. And there are other people who were born in situations where they literally get everything handed to them throughout their entire life resource-wise. And one situation has clear advantages over the other situation. And you might say that person had a measure of privilege. So the words are not the exact same, but there is some crossover between the two. And some of those elements of privilege do create advantages, right? Like there are certain, there is an advantage to being a majority in the United States, right? Like there's a lot of stuff as a white person I don't have to think about. And there are certain disadvantages to being a minority. And at the same time, like you said, we always compare, we understand our situation through, comparing and contrasting. We do that even on a biological level. I think I read someplace, I'm trying to remember exactly where I read it, that said that the human body doesn't feel temperature. We just feel the contrast of temperature, which is why if it's springtime and it's been 40 degrees, when it bumps up to like 60, 65 degrees, it feels warm. But if it's in the middle of summer and it's been 90 degrees and it drops down to 65 degrees, you feel cold and need to go get a sweater. Like in the first situation, you might wear shorts, and in the second situation, you're grabbing a sweater. It's because we only experience contrast. That's how we understand things. So when we're talking about privilege and advantage, those are very subjective terms. It's been co-opted in a way where it seems to be concrete, but these are still abstractions, and they're still understood in terms of contrast between what we see and what we experience.
Yeah.
And so the concept of advantage, I mean, one of the things that I think about is human. You said we have advantages as a species. I'm like, yeah, we're not in the food chain. That's nice, right? As a human, I'm not going to end my life by being eaten, which most animals do. That's kind of an advantage. That's cool. And I have increased consciousness and awareness. I have self-awareness. I have the ability to understand myself in the universe. I have the ability to understand time and tools in a very sophisticated way in comparison to most of the species on the planet. I mean, there's a couple species that understand time, and some of them understand tools. And then we feel weird about eating those animals because they're so smart. And we're like, maybe we shouldn't make them food if they're like, crafting tools, right? So we understand that there's certain advantages that we have, so much so that when we see other animals emulating it, we feel weird about eating them. And so we as a human species have a lot of advantages. And we as a collective in this time period in history have a lot of advantages, like the technologies we were mentioning.
And it's very easy. I guess the reason I mentioned all of that and try to get that distinction is if you can zoom out and have a little bit of a meta perspective, you could see somebody maybe in a developed country that's very wealthy that has, quote unquote, a lot of advantages, from a fundamental resource standpoint. They might have a lot of disadvantages in other ways. And if you look at the contrast to that, it's hard to see this sometimes because it's such a visceral example. But even a child that made it through that childbirth situation where most infants die in childbirth or die in young childhood as like a toddler or baby, even there, in the midst of their disadvantage, there are other advantages that they have. I might not be able to know what they are or point to them right now, but there are advantages every one of us have that other people don't based on our individual circumstance. I guess the point I'm making, and that's an extreme thing to say, and you have to take a very high meta perspective to see that, because you're like, what? How could a baby be born into a developed country and have any advantage at all? I don't have a good answer for that, but I do know that it seems like all of us have nuance of advantage and disadvantage. Doesn't really matter where we land. I just know that's the pattern that's played out. So I guess using imagination, using a meta perspective to the degree you could really attune yourself to, you could begin to have gratitude for all the advantages you have in your life, even if they're not obvious in an like quote unquote objective outside view way. There are advantages that you have that will allow you to feel empowered about your life, no matter what your circumstance is. And I think that's the point I'm trying to hit here is that, and it may not be obvious and it may not be a lot of advantages, but all of us have advantages and disadvantages unique to who we are as people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you die and the story is over, your advantages end. So
Correct.
like you're basically saying that if you were born in that context, not the child that succumbs to the infant mortality rate and dies before 5 has advantages, like their story ended and the advantages ended.
Correct.
However, a person raised in that context might in some weird ways have advantages that we can't even fathom at this point. That's not to say that they do. I mean, there are people who, they're pretty disadvantaged in almost every conceivable way. And so it's hard to find that. But I think what you're suggesting, Joel, is to have an open mind about this, because it's
Correct.
It's not so much whether or not we're arguing that a person in a universally horrific situation, we're not arguing that they do have advantages. I think what you're saying more is it's really easy for us as individuals to assume we're the disadvantaged ones. And so if we can leave our minds and space open enough to go, maybe somebody has advantage in the worst possible context ever, then if I look at my situation in comparing and contrasting, which was what humans naturally do, maybe I'm going to be able to find some advantages that I have too.
Beautifully stated. Thank you. Because it's very easy for, I think, my words misinterpreted. So I think you brought some clarity to what I was trying to say. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's pretty, we see our disadvantages all the time because those are the ceilings we bump up against. Like, we're always getting challenged and frustrated with our lack of advantages. And so those become really obvious to us. Whereas our advantages make things like it just greases the wheels. And so we might be doing things that with ease that we don't even recognize because it's a black swan situation. Like, we would only know it if it was a problem, but it's not a problem, so we don't even see it. So most of the advantages that we have as individuals are things that are we're almost blind to them. And I mean, not all the time. When there's pretty clear advantages, like somebody who's exceptionally beautiful and gets a lot of attention for being exceptionally attractive usually goes, okay, I get it now. The outer world feedback has told me that I have some advantages for this. Now, generally, there are disadvantages that come along with it that it's easy for people on the outside to not see those disadvantages because they're not experiencing them. We experience our disadvantages, so they become very obvious to us. And so somebody who's exceptionally beautiful might have the challenge of not being able to create intimate relationships because everybody wants what they possess. And so everybody objectifies them. And it's hard for them to like actually have a real conversation with somebody who isn't trying to just be around them for the gains that that individual will get.
Sure.
So that's a disadvantage that comes along with that. But that's not something anybody from the outside would know, because very few people are exceptionally beautiful.
Correct.
So there are the disadvantages we experience are super obvious, and the advantages we experience are less obvious unless they become disadvantages.
Well, I think from a global perspective, I believe the human race has some inherent good and wants to elevate us as a species. There's a lot of people working, for example, in what I would consider, from an objective, my perspective, a less advantaged place. So developing countries, maybe socioeconomic statuses, different people groups that have what looks like resource struggle, survival struggle that a lot of us in the Western world don't experience on a day-to-day basis. There's a lot of people, I believe, attending to that, looking at that. I think we could do more as a species to help elevate all of us to a baseline. Again, an advantage as a species, we can help the underprivileged, the underadvantaged, the people that really struggle more than us for resource. I think that's a good thing, to attune ourselves to that and say we can help with those things. But here's where I think, and this is the kind of the point I was leading up to. In order to do that, it doesn't require us to basically not own or claim the advantages that we do have. So what I see emerging is, I see there's people that struggle in the world, in these countries, these socioeconomic groups, these people groups, they're struggling. I have a lot of advantage in my life. The best way to help them is to deny and suppress the advantages I have that I bring to the world. Like I'll maybe a tangible representation of this is like a vow of poverty. I'll vow poverty, and that'll help those people, right? If I vow poverty, that will help those people. That's a zoomed in example, but just take that example for a minute. By vowing poverty, you've done nothing to necessarily solve the problem. All you've done is you've put yourself at a synthetic disadvantage. So now you don't have the empowerment, the resource to give to others. All you've done is you've basically put yourself down on not the exact same footing. Obviously, you're not exactly there, but you've put yourself at a lower advantage state. So now you don't have the empowerment to help out when it might become appropriate for you. Again, that's a very zoomed in example of a principle I'm trying to make here, is that the solution to this is not to give up the advantages you have, like not to say, well, I feel guilty for advantages I have, maybe living in Western developed countries, access to the internet, access to resource, access to the wealth and abundance that we've created in the Western, maybe developed countries. And again, this is just examples. It's not to downplay that or to distance yourself from that. I believe it's to embrace the advantages we have and attune them toward elevating everyone together as a collective. So we see our individual advantages. I talked about that idea of collective advantage versus individual advantage. We tend to demonize our individual advantages sometimes. We even project on other people, they're bad and wrong for doubling down on the advantage they have. Maybe they're really talented in this one area. They're able to generate resource. They've got a talent or a skill to communicate well here. They have that advantage over everybody else. That's unfair. That's wrong. And look at all these people suffering over here on this side. We need to downplay that or demonize that or feel guilty about it. That'll help elevate everybody else. And I would posit that's the exact opposite way of thinking about it.
Well, I think that's where this conversation actually ends up at crossing paths between the idea that luck favors the advantage and luck favors the prepared. Is that if you do have an advantage, then take advantage of your advantage and continue to prepare yourself. If you deny or neglect your advantage, then you are not in a position to be prepared, and so then you're not in a position to help. Like you're basically indicating that people have a tendency when they see somebody who's less advantaged than them, if they feel guilt or experience sympathy or even empathy for the other person. It's much easier to to pretend like you're dragging yourself down quote unquote, to their level, than to come up with a solution that brings them up to your level. And quote unquote up, right? Because we're using very subjective terminology based on again humans' tendency to compare and contrast. So that's not a solution. Like like you said, taking a vow, I don't see people vowing poverty. I just see them celebrating it. I see them thinking it's some sort of virtue, like poverty is a virtue. The challenge is that poverty also really limits your ability to act. It limits your freedom because if you're in poverty, you're usually spending a lot more time on menial chores, on menial tasks, on just trying to get to the next day. I mean, we've spent the majority of our human history in poverty, and it took us hours and hours and hours to do basic things that now take us 5 minutes. So that's basically like the advantage to the modern world is that we free up our time to be able to focus on solutions. So if you are, quote unquote, synthetically dragging yourself down, and I'm using down in quotes because it's a compare and contrast situation. If you're synthetically bringing yourself down, all you're doing is you're behaving as if you've solved something that you haven't solved at all. And we do that because it's easy. It's easy to do it that way as opposed to creating solutions to bring other people to a better position. It makes me think of that song, Common People. There's the entire purpose of the song, and I think it's a great song, but it's basically this girl who's the song is a story of a girl who's incredibly wealthy and is talking to a guy at a bar, and he's like poor, and she's saying that I'd like to be like common people, like I want to live like you people do, and the guy looks at her and he's like, yeah, you'll never know what it's like to be me. You will never know because you will always have a safety net. Like even if you give up all your money and live in a rat-infested apartment like I do, and bum cigarettes, off of other people, and you're just oily like the rest of the masses because you eating greasy fries as your primary meal or whatever. Like there's all these details to being poor that even if you match all those details, you will never get into the mindset of thinking that I can't just call somebody as a lifeline and have a different situation. Like you will always know that about yourself. So you will never be like us. You will never be a quote unquote common person. So even in those situations when we are in a country that affords us the ability to generate some resource, if we're savvy and smart and hardworking or just one of those, sometimes you just have to be savvy or you have to be smart or you have to be hardworking. Like you don't necessarily have to be all of them. And you can generate some resource. And when we don't do that, right? When we go, well, no, the rest of the world is disadvantaged, and so I'm going to meet them at their level. Like, we're not really meeting them at their level. Like, we'll never know what it's like to be a person in as a person who was born in a developed country, I will never know the struggle a person in a developing country is actually experiencing. So this idea of like meeting them there is also it's a fantasy that might resolve some guilt that I experience, but it's not, it's just a fantasy. But what we could do, especially through our hard work and our savvy and being smart, is we could come up and utilizing the time that has been created through not having to say hunt and gather and be farmers all day long and to spend 3 days doing laundry or whatever it is, right? Like we actually take advantage of the resources and the advantages that we have. Now we free up all this time to solve problems and challenges, as long as, of course, we can get out of like being self-obsessed with our own problems. See, the more we focus on our disadvantages, which may or may not exist in reality, they're all subjective, but the more we focus on our own disadvantages, the more we're spending all that time that we've recouped through modern technology and through resource gathering, the more we spend that time just focused on ourselves and what our problems are. But if we can start to focus on our advantages and recognize that through those advantages, we're able to be more and more prepared, then we can now problem solve. We can actually take those advantages and amalgamate them and create some actual, alchemization around helping other people come to the position that we are, because now we're problem solvers. We're not just sympathizers.
And I also want to say, so the frame of this again was luck favoring the prepared, or luck favoring the advantaged, right? And to some degree, luck, we're kind of using luck, like getting lucky, being lucky or being unlucky. We're using that almost as a way of saying there's a bunch of, like in the last podcast we just talked about, there's a bunch of nodes in a system running in your life you may not have a lot of control over. And that's kind of almost how we're grouping luck or unluck, is maybe pre-existing conditions, maybe the nodes in a system that are running we don't have influence or control over. And I think really what this zooms in on is this notion that this idea of prepared or advantaged is that there are nodes that you do have influence over, or that you were just given when you were born. In the case of advantage, you're given these nodes. And in the case of prepared, you've acquired access and influence over them to be able to influence the way that luck or unluck comes into your life. So I just want to kind of bring us back to the framework that we started this conversation with. And I just want to also just, again, point this out, because I think a lot of people lose sight of this idea of advantage. For some reason, we as humans equate advantage to lack of challenges, lack of problems, and the person will always be lucky. We really overvalue that. And I remember when I used to work at a zoo years ago, I was in the marketing and communications office at a zoo. I remember talking to the person that was in charge of fundraising, and he had had a lot of experience in the fundraising world. And basically his job, he had worked, I think, at some big theme parks and some big places, some big nonprofits actually that he had worked with. And he had hobnobbed with very, very, very wealthy people and the children of very, very, very wealthy people. And I asked him and some of the other people in the office, like, what was the experience there? And they began to explain the perspective and the hardship. And when I use that word hardship, you might even have a gut reaction. Like, how could they have hardship? They've got tons of money. They have no problems. But he explained the hardship. Just one example of the hardship they faced was because of so much wealth in the family, all of their interpersonal relationships were caught up in the notion of wealth management and wealth allocation and wealth distribution amongst their family. And so they, inside their family, couldn't really tell if their father felt love for them. It was all tethered to this notion of like resource passing down, and there was all this insecurity. They felt guilty and insecure about maybe some of the wealth they had. And you're going, boo-hoo, poor wealthy people feeling bad about whatever. But these are real people. Like, what if you had been born in that situation? Like, you don't know their experience, just as much as we don't know the experience of somebody who was born into complete poverty. So this notion of advantage from the outside looks like it's advantaged, and sometimes maybe it's not as much of an advantage as we would project onto that. So I just want to make a note to that we automatically, there's so much laden with the word advantage, right? There's so much narrative and so much emotional charge we bring to that. I just wanted to give a little bit of a perspective to say that be very thoughtful how you engage with that word and what you project onto that, or how we all overvalue our own experience. And so we're going to bring to the table, I do this too, we bring to the table our perspective of what it would mean for us, but it doesn't always mean that for the other person on the other side. So I just want to make that distinction. Did you have anything you say about that, by the way?
Oh, why are you going to move on to something else?
I have something else I'd like to say, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on that if you wanted to.
Oh, I might have actually even tangented. I was just going to add that, again, these are entire systems running. It's not cause and effect. The assumption that a person who maybe is wealthy or exceptionally beautiful or extremely talented will always have happiness is the one-to-one correlation. That's cause-effect thinking. But there are always entire systems running. There are wealthy people who are ecstatically happy with their lives, and there are wealthy people who are contemplating suicide right now. There are poor people who are ecstatically happy with their lives, and there are poor people who are contemplating suicide right now. You could
apply that to health too. Healthy people, unhealthy people.
Absolutely. There are so many different contexts where there's an entire system running, and until you know what the system is, you can't really judge, you can't project onto that person what you assume is the emergent. And I think what it does is it routes back to Maslow's hierarchy. People who are, kind of permanently stuck at the safety and security level of Maslow, it's such a frustrating place to be stuck. And there are problems at safety and security, especially if you're just trying to pay the bills, and it's so hard to get traction in your life. It's so hard to establish really healthy relationships and to feel a sense of self-esteem, right? Like, that's why it's a pyramid. Safety and security is next to the bottom. It's not at the bottom, but most of us are not in survival. If we're at a financial place, we're in safety and security. And it can be so frustrating to get stuck there over and over. So anybody who's not in that situation, we assume is having a great time of it. But every single level of Maslow's hierarchy comes with it its own challenges that feel like they're your entire human experience. Like, they feel like everything to you. So being stuck at a certain level, it does feel like everybody else who's not stuck at, like if you're at love and belongingness and you admire exceptionally beautiful people who you assume have, have an easy time of having relationships. Well, maybe they're always in a relationship, but that doesn't mean they've nailed that level, right? They haven't completely mastered it just because they easily attract people into their lives. Same thing with safety and security. A person who's dealing with that might look at somebody who's really wealthy and assume that they've got that whole safety and security piece down. But what if they don't? What if they're actually in debt, right? What if safety and security is something they think about all the time because they're afraid somebody's going to break into their house and kill them to take it? Safety and security is beyond just money resource. So it's easy to project onto other people an ultimate solution because you believe it would be your ultimate solution, forgetting that these things might not be ultimate solutions. They carry with them their own challenges, and that's across the board.
So I'd like to take all of that and posit a little bit of a shift in maybe the terminology we use. We just said luck favors the prepared. This idea of preparing yourself. Maybe if you want to be a published author someday and you prepare yourself to have a book idea when someone comes into your world, or luck favors the advantaged. You're really advantaged, and there's people that are advantaged that can't take advantage of luck, even that comes into their sphere. This idea of luck favoring the advantaged, luck favoring the prepared. What if we recast this and said luck favors the empowered? So we shift those two words from prepared and advantaged to empowered, because there's a lot of advantaged people in the world, resource-wise, relationship-wise, that are not empowered. They're advantaged in some way. They just got that pre-existing condition. And there's other people that are really prepared, but they're not empowered. There's this sense of empowerment. And again, it goes back to what we talked about in the last episode, where we talk about getting really good at figuring out which nodes in the system of your life you have influence over, and taking as much influence over those as possible, and realizing which nodes in your life you have no influence over, and not sweating it, being like, look, I can't control this. I'm going to just let it go. Getting the nuance down of that and really dialing into which nodes you have influence over and taking control of those nodes, or taking influence over those nodes. Again, we talked about in the last podcast, that's really the work. And it's this idea that is coming from an empowered place. So when luck or unluck comes into your life, it doesn't really matter, because you as a person, as a self-contained sovereign unit on this planet, living right now, listening to my voice, have full and total empowerment over the nodes in the system of your life that you can have influence over. I think that shift right there, you hear this phrase, I make my own luck. That's a statement from someone who is, their luck is coming from an empowered place. I make my own luck is, it doesn't really matter my circumstance. Maybe it goes really badly for me. Maybe I'm terribly unlucky, but I'm going to be empowered throughout it. I'm going to be empowered regardless of the luck or the unluck in my life.
Yeah. I think one thing, I don't, that was such a beautiful way to wrap everything up. So I'm almost hesitant to say anything because it's true. That's really what it comes down to, is feeling empowered. The only thing that comes up for me when you say that, and this is something I think I wanted to say in the last podcast, I'm kind of hinted at it, but I don't think I completed the concept. And that is, when you look at systems and all these different nodes of the system, one of the big nodes is always time. And I mentioned in the last podcast that time is something that we really can't control. We can experience it faster or slower, but it in of itself just continues on at the pace it continues on at. And when it comes to being empowered, and when it comes to creating the system that you want to get the emergent, or the system required to get the emergent or the result that you want, remember that time is always a part of that. And empowerment happens in stages. What we talk about empowerment all the time on this podcast, and we mention it as maybe the end game. Oftentimes it happens through a sense of ego transcendence. We let go of being so attached to our own sense of how the world should look and how the world should perceive us, and whether or not we're being valued and honored in the way that our ego wants to rest into this idea that we're safe and that we're going to be okay. Most of the time, empowerment comes from sort of letting all that dialogue go and letting all that narrative go. We just kind of go, you know what? I don't have to be attached to outcomes. It's going to be fine. And empowerment happens by letting go of all of our narratives and stories that are unhealthy for us, that we don't even realize are unhealthy until we look back in retrospect and go, man, I was caught. I was caught in my own mental vice grip. I was just I had my brain in a vice and I could not think. So a lot of empowerment happens slowly over time and in stages. And it as an end game might be one of the most, it might be the single highest leverage point for happiness that either of us have personally experienced. But even if you're not happy every second of every day, you at least have the ability to do something about it. That's the point of being empowered, is that you don't constantly feel stuck. You don't constantly feel like a victim. You don't constantly feel like you're on the receiving end of whatever the world has to give to you. You feel like you've got some part of this. You've got some influence. You've got some say. Even if you don't have ultimate say, you at least have say over how you feel. So most of what we try to do here at Personality Hacker in the podcast and in other resources is we try to give you tools to continue on that path of empowerment. Like each of these things we talk about, personality types, personality psychology in general, a lot of the ego reference we do, systems thinking, Graves model, a lot of the models that we teach are all tools to help you feel like you've got this. It's going to be okay. You can figure it out. So this whole concept of luck favoring the prepared, luck favoring the advantaged, luck favoring the empowered, however you want to see it, it really comes down to getting out of that sense that you're on the receiving end of life and that you have control over how you feel, you have control over your thoughts, you have control how you're going to you're going to show up. And until the lights go out, right? Until that time that you die, you have a lot of ability to navigate this world in an empowered way. I just wanted to add that timepiece, even though I thought what you said, Joel, was brilliant. I just want to add that timepiece because I also want to validate that it takes time. It's a process. It doesn't happen. I mean, if it happens overnight, right? Like all of a sudden you feel empowered, it's because you've been working on it unconsciously for a long time. You might have a light bulb on switch on moments where all of a sudden you get it, but it's because you've been doing work on a subterranean level for a long time. It does take time, but if you're on that track and you let yourself keep being prepared in that way by developing those skills and building that tool system, or like gathering tools and being truly prepared, and then understanding the ways in which you're advantaged, not focusing on the ways in which you're disadvantaged, but focusing on the ways in which you are advantaged, recognizing that what crosses us supports us and vice versa. Sometimes the things that we have that look like nothing but advantage to the outside world is actually in a large way disadvantage, and vice versa. Sometimes the ways in which we're disadvantaged incentivize us to work super duper hard, and then we build skills that other people miss because we were forced to in our life. So focus on the ways in which you are advantaged, focus on the ways in which you have power and control in your life, get really good at looking at these systems, and give yourself a little bit, like cut yourself some slack if it's taking some time, because time is always a node in the system and you have to honor it. So if it takes time, that's cool. That's fine. It takes time for all of us, but eventually you can get to that place where you are empowered. And those, like Joel said, those are the people who make their own luck.
Yeah. So what do you think? You've been listening to this podcast. Maybe you should go back and listen to the one before if you're a brand new listener, because I think they build on each other. But we want to hear from you. We want your voice to be represented. You're hearing us right now, but you can't talk back. You don't have a microphone in front of you. Your microphone is going to be over at personalityhacker.com, where you can leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast and other podcasts. And you can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.